This is the story of Formula One's new teams that competed in the Formula One World Championship during the 2010s. Running on limited budgets, the three teams in question rarely got themselves off the back of the grid to tangle with the more established teams of the time, but nonetheless had their own exciting and challenging battles for the coveted 10th place in the Constructors' Championship. As with 2012, the rule changes for 2013 were minor, in preparation for the major rule changes that would come in 2014. The main talking point regarding car design in 2012 was the so-called platypus noses, which attracted criticism for their unsightly appearance. So for 2013, modesty panels were permitted to be added to the sides of the nose cones in order to smoothen the shape out. Pirelli had also revised the tyre compounds to make them even less durable than before, making four-stop strategies commonplace. However, the biggest change for 2013 was the absence of HRT, which reduced the grid from 24 to 22 cars, and made the six-way battle at the back of the grid a four-way battle instead. Caterham remained undefeated at the back of the grid. However, in 3 years they had made little progress in breaking into the midfield, and were yet to score a point. Charles Pique's move to Caterham from Marussia was announced at the Brazilian Grand Prix the previous year. Heikki Kovalainen left the team after 3 years together as their relationship had broken down towards the end of 2012, and Vitaly Petrov ended up losing his seat as well due to lack of sponsorship. On February 1st, they announced that their 2012 reserve driver Guido van der Garde would take their second driver's seat, and 4 days later they unveiled their 2013 car, the CT03. The car was a clear evolution from the CT01, but the most striking change was the livery, which had been lightened and given a metallic finish. They had also opted not to add modesty panels to the nose. 3 pre-season testing sessions were planned for 2013. One at Jerez from February 5th to 8th, another at Catalonia from February 19th to 22nd, and a third test also at Catalonia from February 28th to March 3rd. Van der Garde ran on the first 2 days of the first test and then Pique on the final 2. They swapped around for the second test, and Van der Garde got to do some wet weather running on the final day. Intermittent rain caused disruptions at the final test, but overall pre-season testing ran far better than in previous years. On the second day of the final test, they also announced that Alexander Rossi would begin his second year as reserve driver, and would also be joined by HRT's 2012 reserve driver Mark Kinghua, who would also drive for Caterham's GP2 team. After testing had finished, they brought on Jordan Renault and Lotus veteran Harry Roberts as their new head of aerodynamics. Marussia had made big improvements towards the end of 2012, but losing 10th in the Constructors' Championship in the dying moments of the final race dealt a huge blow to their finances. Charles Pique left the team for their rivals Caterham, and on December 18th his seat was taken by Marussia's 2012 reserve driver Max Chilton. Timo Glock had been contracted to stay with the team until 2014, but on January 31st he unexpectedly announced he was leaving the team due to their precarious financial situation. On the morning of day 1 of the first pre-season test, Marussia unveiled their 2013 car, the MR02. Like with Caterham, it was a clear evolution of its predecessor which it bore a strong resemblance to, and it also had a revamped livery, with the vertical black, white and red stripes being turned horizontal. By far the biggest change was the implementation of KERS, which would finally put them on an equal footing with Caterham. Chilton jumped straight into the car for the first test, and on day 2 they announced that their former test driver and the 2012 GP2 Series runner-up Louis Razier would be joining them as first driver, and he then got a day in the car. Razier was abruptly removed from Marussia's lineup for the second test, which Chilton ran alone. He was also absent from the final test, and on the second day his contract was terminated after just 23 days due to his sponsors failing to pay the team, and it was announced that he would be replaced by Force India reserve driver, 2012 Formula Renault 3.5 Series runner-up and Ferrari Academy driver Jules Bianchi, who got 2 days in the car to acclimatise. 2 weeks later, Caterham and Marussia headed to Melbourne for the first race. On the Thursday, Marussia also announced Rodolfo Gonzalez as their new reserve driver, who had done tests for Caterham in previous years. Both teams had gone through far fewer stumbling blocks to make it to the first race than in previous years, so things went much smoother for them. Clean running was achieved in practice, aside from Van der Garde spinning off into the gravel in FP2, but the main area of concern was that they were still slowest in the timings. Melbourne had experienced a long drought and heatwave in the summer of 2013, but that came to an end on Saturday morning as rain came towards the end of FP3. The rain got much heavier in the afternoon and qualifying was delayed by 30 minutes. All 4 drivers did continuous laps in order to find grip on the ever-changing tarmac. Van der Garde span off early and pitted for a new nose, and Pique span on his final run after switching from wet to intermediate tyres. Bianchi came out on top and qualified in 19th, 0.4 of a second off of the Sauber of fellow rookie Esteban Gutierrez. Chilton was 0.75 of a second slower in 20th. Van der Garde was 0.6 of a second slower in 21st, and Pique was over a second slower in 22nd and last. He was just outside the 107% time but was still permitted to race. For only the second time, Marussia had qualified both cars ahead of both Caterhams. The rain forced Q2 and Q3 to be run on the Sunday morning, but for the race it was overcast but dry. The Sauber of Nico Hülkenberg withdrew from the race due to a fuel feed issue which moved the 4 drivers to 18th to 21st. Chilton had a very poor start and was passed by both Caterhams off the line. Bianchi, by contrast, had a great start and passed Esteban Gutierrez and Daniel Ricciardo into turn 1. Chilton recovered and got back past both Caterhams on the run to turn 3. Chilton and Van der Garde were then also able to pass Ricciardo into turn 5. Gutierrez got back past Bianchi at turn 13. At the end of lap 1, Bianchi was 17th, Chilton 18th, Van der Garde 19th and Pique 21st. Bianchi took Pastor Maldonado into turn 1 on lap 2, Van der Garde took Chilton and Pique also took Ricciardo. Maldonado repassed Bianchi on lap 4 and Ricciardo recovered to pass Pique, Chilton and Van der Garde on lap 5. Chilton, Van der Garde, Pique and Bianchi all made their first pit stops on laps 6, 7, 8 and 9 respectively. Chilton had to change his front wing as he had lightly snagged it when passing Van der Garde. They emerged from their pit stops with Bianchi 18th, Van der Garde 19th, Pique 20th and Chilton 21st. Van der Garde developed a slow puncture on his second set of tyres and was passed by Pique on lap 12 and then pitted for a second time on lap 16 and came out a lap down behind the leading cars. Bianchi in this time had stormed ahead and was 16 seconds in front of Pique, and Chilton was 8 seconds further back after his nose change. Chilton did his second stop on lap 19 and came up behind Van der Garde in 19th. Retirements for Pastor Maldonado, Nico Rosberg and Daniel Ricciardo gave everyone 3 places. Chilton gradually closed in on Van der Garde and after several attempts managed to pass him for 17th on lap 48. Bianchi stormed ahead of his rivals to finish in 15th. His fastest lap was the 11th fastest of the race. He just avoided being lapped twice by race winner Kimi Raikkonen but was over a minute behind the next car. Pique ran a 2-stop strategy but lost curves towards the end of the race and was lapped twice to finish 20 seconds behind Bianchi in 16th. Chilton was 34 seconds behind in 17th and Van der Garde dropped off at the end to finish 25 seconds behind in 18th and last. A week later it was time for Caterham's home race, the Malaysian Grand Prix. Rain came in FP2 which allowed more wet weather running. A dry qualifying gave the 4 drivers their first indication of their true 1-lap pace. Bianchi was fastest again in 19th, only a quarter of a second off of the next car, and less than 2 seconds off of the fastest Q1 time. Pique was next, 9/10 of a second slower in 20th. Chilton was 3/10 of a second behind in 21st, and Van der Garde another 3/10 of a second behind in 22nd. Marussia had more than halved the deficit to the fastest cars compared to the previous year. A downpour an hour before the start of the race meant all drivers started on intermediate tyres. Bianchi had a terrible start and got passed by all 3 cars into turn 1. Van der Garde also got past Chilton. Pique then managed to pass Valtteri Bottas, Jean-Eric Vergne, Esteban Gutierrez and Pastor Maldonado at turn 2. Vergne in turn was also passed by Van der Garde and Chilton. Bianchi got past Chilton at turn 4, Vergne repassed Chilton at turn 7 and Maldonado repassed Pique at turn 9. Bottas had an off at turn 13 and was passed by everyone. Fernando Alonso's front wing broke off underneath the car at the start of lap 2 and sent him into the gravel which gave everyone a place. Vergne repassed Van der Garde at turn 1 and Gutierrez repassed Pique at turn 4. Vergne then passed Pique at turn 15. Bottas passed Chilton at turn 1 on lap 3. The track was quickly drying out, so Bianchi, Van der Garde and Chilton all pitted for dry tyres at the end of lap 6. There was enough of a gap between Bianchi and Chilton for Marussia to execute a double stack. However, Bianchi's stop was slow which allowed Van der Garde to come out ahead, despite Van der Garde developing a puncture on his in-lap. Force India also did a double stack, which went far worse than Marussia and left Adrian Sutil behind Van der Garde and Paul di Resta behind Bianchi and Bottas. Bianchi managed to pass Sutil at turn 4, but was passed again at turn 14. Pique then pitted for dry tyres on lap 7. As he was entering his pit box, Jean-Eric Vergne was released from his, and the 2 collided side-on which broke off Pique's front wing. Both were fitted with new front wings, but Vergne got out first. After all this, Van der Garde was 14th, Bianchi 16th, Chilton 19th and Pique 21st. Di Resta passed Bianchi at turn 1 on lap 9. Sutil and Di Resta both passed Van der Garde and Bottas passed Bianchi at turn 15. Bottas then passed Van der Garde at turn 15 on lap 10. Vergne took 19th from Chilton at turn 1 on lap 13. Maldonado ran wide at turn 8 on lap 13 and broke his front wing and was passed by Van der Garde and Bianchi. He then pitted and came out behind Chilton and Peak as well. The 4 drivers made their next pit stops from laps 17 to 20. Bianchi jumped Van der Garde and Maldonado ended up in between Van der Garde and Chilton. Retirements for both Force Indias due to dodgy wheel nuts on laps 23 and 28 gave everyone 2 more places. Maldonado passed Van der Garde at turn 15 on lap 24. Peak in last first got lapped on lap 26 by the Red Bulls, running in multi-21 formation. He'd gradually closed up to Chilton and attempted a pass at turn 1 on lap 29. He then successfully passed him at turn 1 on lap 31 while they were being lapped by Lewis Hamilton. Peak managed to close up to Van der Garde during the 4th stint and passed him on lap 42. Maldonado eventually passed Bianchi on lap 44, but then retired 2 laps later with a KERS failure. Daniel Ricciardo and Jenson Button retired on laps 52 and 54, which gave everyone 2 more places. Bianchi put in another strong performance to finish in 13th, 1 lap down on the winner, but 54 seconds behind the next car. Peak drove strongly after his pit stop fracas to finish 34 seconds behind in 14th. Van der Garde struggled towards the end and finished 9 seconds behind in 15th. Chilton was caught early by the blue flags and was lapped twice to finish in 16th and last. Next up was the Chinese Grand Prix. Marussia brought their first upgrades of the season with new suspension and brake ducts. Caterham gave Ma Qinghua his first outing in the CT03 and FP1 for his home race. Chilton managed only 5 laps in FP2 before the engine cut out. He was returned to the garage and sent back out again 10 minutes before the end of the session, but the engine immediately cut out again. Bianchi was fastest in qualifying for the 3rd consecutive race, qualifying in 19th, 8/10 of a second behind Esteban Gutierrez. Chilton was 7/10 of a second further back in 20th after having to abort his second run due to a water pressure issue. Peak and Van der Garde were both very narrowly behind on the back row. Mark Webber ended up starting for the pit lane, which moved F1 up a place for the start. Bianchi had another good start and tried to take Gutierrez into turn 1. Chilton's start was much worse and he was passed by both Caterhams. Peak locked up into turn 1 and ran wide, which allowed Chilton back through. Chilton managed to repass Van der Garde at turn 6. Bianchi, Chilton and Van der Garde all passed Jean-Eric Vergne, and at the same time Webber passed Peak. Webber then passed Vergne, Van der Garde and Chilton down the back straight into turn 14, where Van der Garde also passed Chilton again. Webber then dived into the pits. Vergne passed Chilton at turn 14 on lap 2. On lap 3, when DRS was enabled, Vergne passed Van der Garde and Peak passed Chilton at turn 14. The following lap, Vergne passed Bianchi and Peak passed Van der Garde at the same place. Gutierrez and Adrian Sutil collided at turn 14 on lap 5, which gave everyone 2 places. Peak made his first pit stop on lap 5, Bianchi and Van der Garde on lap 6, and Chilton on lap 7. Pitting first gave the advantage to Peak, who ended up 16th just in front of Maldonado, with Bianchi, Van der Garde and Chilton 18th, 19th and 20th. Maldonado passed Peak at turn 1 on lap 9. Bianchi attempted a pass on Peak at turn 1 on lap 10. Chilton managed to pass Van der Garde on lap 15 and Mark Webber on lap 16, which gave everyone a place. Nico Rosberg then retired on lap 23, which gave everyone another place as well. By this point, the 4 drivers had paired off, with Peak and Bianchi creating a 20-second gap over Chilton and Van der Garde. Van der Garde first got the blue flags on lap 33, which was well past 50% race distance. Bianchi passed Peak during their 3rd pit stops. The race ended with Bianchi on top again in 16th, with Peak only 2 seconds behind in 17th. Chilton was 36 seconds further back in 18th, and Van der Garde fell off at the end and was 31 seconds behind in 19th and last. Caterham restructured the team for the Bahrain Grand Prix. Heikki Kovalainen returned to the team as a reserve and development driver. Alexander Rossi and Ma Qinghua remained as reserve drivers, however Rossi took Ma's seat in the GP2 team after only 1 race weekend. Kovalainen ran in FP1 in place of Van der Garde, and Rodolfo Gonzalez also got his first go in the MR02 in place of Bianchi in FP1. However, he only managed 7 laps before the gearbox gave up. Caterham introduced some minor upgrades to Peak's cars, including a new rear wing, new side pod wings, and a Pelican-style nose. Peak's upgrades paid off as he came out on top in qualifying, half a second behind Esteban Gutierrez. Bianchi was 9/10 of a second behind in 20th, and Van der Garde narrowly beat Chilton. A grid penalty for Gutierrez moved everyone up 1 place. Both Marussias had great starts and passed both Caterhams into turn 1. A puncture for Adrian Sutil at turn 8 gave everyone a place. Gutierrez made contact with Peak at turn 10 and came into the pits. Chilton was then passed by both Caterhams at turn 13. Jean-Eric Vergne span at turn 4 on lap 2. Peak, Bianchi and Chilton were able to get around him, but Van der Garde collided with him and destroyed his front wing. Both then crawled round to the pits for repairs and came out far behind everyone else. Bianchi passed Peak at turn 4 on lap 4, but Peak took it back at turn 8. At the end of lap 4, Peak, Bianchi and Chilton were running in formation in 16th, 17th and 18th. Then they had Gutierrez 20 seconds behind, and then Vandergaard another 20 seconds behind after his pit stop, followed by Sutil and Verne, who were on the cusp of being lapped. Sutil caught and passed Vandergaard on lap 11, Chilton on lap 24, Bianchi on lap 25 and Peak on lap 35. Gutierrez passed both Marussias during their third pit stops on laps 37 and 38. Peak ran an instant free race to finish in 17th, less than 10 seconds behind Daniel Ricciardo and just half a second in front of Gutierrez. Bianchi struggled and was 37 seconds behind in 19th. Chilton was 12 seconds behind in 20th, and Vandergaard had his race destroyed on lap 4 and was over a lap behind in 21st and last. Heikki Kovalainen drove in FP1 again at the Spanish Grand Prix in place of Peak, and Rodolfo Gonzalez drove in place of Chilton, and both enjoyed some wet weather running. Vandergaard was given the same upgrades that Peak had received at Bahrain, and Caterham tried out another new front wing. It was Vandergaard that came out on top in qualifying, although he was 1.3 seconds behind Pastor Maldonado in 18th. Bianchi was only 0.05 of a second behind in 20th. Chilton was a quarter of a second behind in 21st, and Peak 1/10 of a second behind in 22nd. A grid penalty for Esteban Gutierrez moved Vandergaard up to 18th. Chilton had a very slow start and immediately fell behind Peak. Bianchi, by contrast, had another great start and passed Vandergaard and Gutierrez, who also passed Vandergaard. In turns 4 and 5, Peak was passed by Chilton, and Bianchi was passed by Gutierrez, Vandergaard and Chilton as well. Vandergaard passed the Williams of Valtteri Bottas at turn 1 on lap 2. Bianchi made contact with Peak and pitted for a new nose at the end of lap 2. Romain Grosjean retired in the pits on lap 9, and Adrian Sutil had a minute-long pit stop which gave everyone 2 places. Bottas managed to pass Vandergaard on lap 16. After the first round of pit stops, Vandergaard and Peak were together in 17th and 18th, and Bianchi and Chilton were running together 30 seconds behind in 20th and 21st. Vandergaard made his second stop on lap 20. His left rear wheel was incorrectly fitted, and on his outlap it came off at turn 11. He crawled round to the pits on 3 wheels and became the first of the 4 drivers that year to retire from a race. Sutil caught and passed Chilton on lap 25, Peak on lap 26 and Bianchi on lap 28. Jean-Eric Verne retired on lap 53, which gave everyone a place. Peak had another strong race and finished in 17th, only 2.5 seconds behind Bottas. Bianchi finished another lap down in 18th, and Chilton was 27 seconds behind in 19th and last. Next was the turn of the Monaco Grand Prix. Rain came for qualifying. Vandergaard managed to just scrape into Q2 for the first time that year. In Q2, he did 1 lap on intermediates, then made an early switch to dry tyres and qualified 15th. Peak, by contrast, was 18th, but still outqualified Esteban Gutierrez. Chilton set the slowest time for 20th, as both Bianchi and Felipe Massa failed to set times. Bianchi's engine cut out on his outlap, but he was permitted to start his unofficial home race. Chilton then received a 5-place grid penalty for an unscheduled gearbox change and was moved back to 22nd. On race day, Bianchi's gearbox wouldn't engage at the start of the formation lap, so he was forced to start from the pit lane. Vandergaard was passed by Maldonado off the line and cut the corner at Saint-Devold, and when he rejoined the racing line he hit Maldonado and damaged Maldonado's front wing. Peak had a good start and got up to 15th in front of Maldonado and Vandergaard. Vandergaard rear-ended Maldonado at the Lowe's hairpin and destroyed his front wing. Peak was passed by Paul di Resta at the Nouvelle chicane. Vandergaard and Maldonado crawled round to the pits and Vandergaard rejoined in 22nd. This left Peak 16th, Chilton 19th and Bianchi 20th. By running in clean air, Vandergaard made an early claim to the fastest lap on lap 5. Peak's race lasted only 7 laps as his engine burst into flames going through the swimming pool chicane on lap 8 and forced him to pull over at the pit lane entrance. Di Resta pitted on lap 9 and came out just in front of Maldonado and Vandergaard, which gave a place to Chilton and Bianchi. Vandergaard lost Kers from lap 10, which impeded his ability to catch up. Di Resta caught and passed Bianchi at Saint-Devold on lap 15 and Chilton at Saint-Devold on lap 80. Maldonado attempted to pass Bianchi at the Nouvelle chicane on lap 22 but made contact and lightly damaged his front wing. Felipe Massa crashed heavily on lap 28, which brought out the safety car. Vandergaard was permitted to unlap himself, and Bianchi took the opportunity to pit. When the race resumed at the end of lap 38, Chilton was 16th, Bianchi 19th and Vandergaard 20th. On lap 45, Chilton was passed by Gutierrez at the Nouvelle chicane. Chilton was pushed off track, which allowed Maldonado to come up alongside him. They made contact, Maldonado's front wing was torn off and he flew into the barriers at the back. The Tech Pro barriers were torn off the Armco by the impact and swung round and hit Bianchi's car head on, which severely crumpled his nose and front wing. The race was immediately red flagged. The race was restarted 25 minutes later with Chilton in 17th, Vandergaard 18th and Bianchi 19th, one lap down as he was in the pits when the red flag was called and hadn't crossed the start-finish line to begin lap 46. Chilton was given a drive-through penalty for causing the collision with Maldonado, which dropped him behind Vandergaard. Bianchi's brakes failed on lap 59 and he crashed into the barriers at Saint-Devote. Daniel Ricciardo and Romain Grosjean then crashed out on lap 62, which gave 2 places to Vandergaard and Chilton and triggered another safety car. Chilton took the chance to pit and Gutierrez pitted, which moved Vandergaard up to 14th. The race resumed at the end of lap 66. Vandergaard was passed by Gutierrez at the Nouvelle Chicane on lap 70 and Kimi Räikkönen pitted for repairs, which moved Vandergaard and Chilton up to 14th and 15th. Räikkönen passed both of them on lap 73, but Sergio Perez also retired, so they maintained position. Chilton passed Vandergaard on lap 77 on much fresher tyres, and the two of them finished a very stop-start race in 14th and 15th. Formula 1 then flew over the Atlantic for the Canadian Grand Prix. Alexander Rossi got his first go in the CT03 and FP1 in place of Pique, and got to run in wet weather. Bianchi managed only 8 laps after he ended up in the escape road at turn 3. The rain stayed for Saturday, and Pique managed to go fastest of the 4 in qualifying, but also beat Romain Grosjean to start 18th. Bianchi was almost a second behind in 20th, then Chilton and Vandergaard half a second behind on the back row. A grid penalty for Grosjean moved Bianchi, Chilton and Vandergaard all up one place. Race day was dry. Vandergaard had a great start and passed Chilton at turn 1 and Bianchi at turn 2, and Chilton was also passed by Grosjean. Vandergaard then passed Pique at turn 3 and Esteban Gutierrez at turn 8. Grosjean then passed Bianchi at turn 13. Gutierrez passed Vandergaard at turn 13 on lap 4, and then Grosjean passed Pique at turn 13 on lap 5. Grosjean then passed Vandergaard at turn 8 on lap 6, which resigned the 4 drivers to the final 4 places in the race. Pique took 19th from Vandergaard at turn 13 on lap 7. Vandergaard then did an early pit stop on lap 8. Bianchi then took 19th from Pique on lap 10, and Pique pitted on lap 11 and came out in 22nd, but passed Vandergaard on lap 16. Vandergaard first got blue flags on lap 19. He was being lapped for a second time by third place Mark Webber on lap 35 at the L'Épingle hairpin, when he turned in on Webber and was sent into a spin which damaged Webber's front wing. For this, he was given a 10-second stop-go penalty, which left him lapped by all his rivals. Bianchi and Chilton ran extremely long first stints and first pitted on laps 41 and 38 respectively, by which point Pique and Vandergaard had already pitted twice. On lap 43, Vandergaard was being lapped by Nico Hülkenberg at turn 13. Hülkenberg squeezed Vandergaard and they made contact, which gave Hülkenberg a puncture and broke Vandergaard's front wing. Despite being right in front of the pit entrance, Vandergaard tried to carry on, however the wing broke off underneath the car and he pulled over at the L'Épingle hairpin. Hülkenberg pulled over in the escape road at turn 3, which gave a place to Bianchi, Chilton and Pique. Pique took advantage of his fresher tyres to catch and pass Chilton for 19th on lap 56. Gutierrez crashed out on lap 64, which gave everyone another place. The race ended with Bianchi in 17th, 2 laps down on winner Sebastian Vettel and 22 seconds behind Pastor Maldonado in 16th. Pique was 15 seconds behind Bianchi in 18th, but was lapped for a third time on the last lap, and Chilton 21 seconds further behind in 19th and last. Next up was the British Grand Prix, Chilton's home race, Caterham's second home race, and Marussia's unofficial home race. FP1 was wet. Pique had an off early on and broke his front wing. Saturday was dry. Pique went fastest in 19th, but over a second behind the next car. Bianchi was a quarter of a second behind in 20th. Vandergaard was a colossal 1.4 seconds slower in 21st, and Chilton 0.4 of a second behind in 22nd. Paul di Resta was excluded from qualifying, which moved everyone up a place, and Vandergaard was given a 5-place grid penalty for causing the accident with Nico Hülkenberg at Canada, so he was moved to 22nd. Di Resta passed all 4 drivers at Arena, and Chilton got past Bianchi and Pique, but Pique took the place back at Luffield. Bianchi then passed Chilton at Stowe on lap 3. Race leader Lewis Hamilton suffered a tyre blowout on the Wellington Straight on lap 8 and crawled round to the pits and came up behind all 4 drivers. The same thing happened to Felipe Massa on lap 10, and he also came up behind all 4 of them. Hamilton passed Vandergaard, Chilton and Bianchi during their first pit stops. Daniel Ricciardo then had a blowout on the hangar straight on lap 14, so the safety car was then deployed. Pique then pitted and came out 18th. The race resumed at the end of lap 21. Massa immediately passed Vandergaard at Club, Chilton at Arena and Bianchi at Luffield. He then passed Peak at Club as well. Van der Garde passed Chilton at Stowe on lap 25. Esteban Gutierrez made an extra pit stop on lap 29 when his front wing exploded and he came out behind Bianchi. Bianchi was passed by Gutierrez on lap 36. Jean-Eric Vergne then retired, which moved everyone up a place. Valtteri Bottas made his final pit stop on lap 38 and came out behind Peak and Bianchi, but passed Bianchi straight away. Race leader Sebastian Vettel retired on lap 41, which brought out a second safety car. Van der Garde pitted and came out behind Chilton, and both were permitted to unlap themselves. The safety car came in at the end of lap 45 for a 7-lap sprint to the finish, with Peak 15th, Bianchi 17th, Chilton 19th and Van der Garde 20th. Bottas passed Peak at Luffield. Another tyre blowout, this time for Sergio Perez on the Hangar Straight, gave everyone a place. Gutierrez passed Bianchi at Brooklands on lap 48. Chilton and Van der Garde were still 20 seconds behind the rest of the pack when the race restarted. Van der Garde briefly passed Chilton on lap 51, but Chilton took the place back. A retirement for Romain Grosjean on the last lap meant Peak finished 15th, Bianchi 16th, Chilton 17th and Van der Garde 18th and last. After this was the German Grand Prix, which this year was being held at the Nürburgring. Rodolfo Gonzalez took Bianchi's seat in FP1. Bianchi only managed 10 laps when he got back in the car for FP2 as he was struggling with an upset stomach. Peak was fastest in qualifying, 1.2 seconds behind Pastor Maldonado. Bianchi was only a tenth of a second behind in 20th. Van der Garde was 7/10 of a second behind in 21st, and Chilton another 3/10 of a second behind in 22nd and last. Peak received a 5-place grid penalty for an unscheduled gearbox change and went back to last. Both Caterhams had good starts and passed both Marussias at turn 1. Van der Garde also passed Valtteri Bottas and Bianchi repassed Peak into turn 3. Van der Garde then passed Jean-Eric Vergne round the outside of turn 7. Felipe Massa spun off on lap 4, which gave everyone a place. Peak pitted on lap 4, Van der Garde and Bianchi on lap 5 and Chilton on lap 8. Mark Webber's right rear wheel came off and hit a cameraman during his pit stop and he came out a lap down behind the rest of the field. He unlapped Chilton on lap 10, Peak and Bianchi on lap 12 and Van der Garde on lap 13. Bianchi got ahead of Van der Garde during the second round of pit stops. Not long after this, on lap 22, Bianchi's car went up in smoke on the approach to turn 13. A couple of minutes after Bianchi pulled over and walked away, the car began rolling back down the hill across the track. This triggered a safety car, and Jean-Eric Vergne also retired, which moved everyone up another place. Van der Garde and Chilton had just done their second stops, but Peak got a free stop and Chilton pitted again. Webber was allowed to unlap himself and so was now right behind Chilton. The race resumed at the end of lap 29. Webber immediately passed Chilton and Peak at turn 1. Webber pushed Peak wide, which allowed Chilton to pass him. Webber then passed Van der Garde at turn 5. Peak developed a slow puncture on lap 34 and so pitted earlier than planned. Despite being on older tyres, Peak passed Chilton on lap 50 and Van der Garde on lap 58. The race ended with Peak 17th, Van der Garde 18th and Chilton 19th. After this, the teams flew back to Silverstone for a young drivers test. Caterham ran Alexander Rossi on day 1. Caterham also announced the Formula Renault 3.5 Series driver Will Stevens had joined their driver academy, and he drove in the car on the second day. Van der Garde and Peak drove on day 3 in order to test out the new tyre compounds that Pirelli had made in response to the numerous tyre blowouts at the British Grand Prix. Marussia announced at the test that they had entered a long-term technical partnership with Ferrari, who would replace Cosworth as their engine supplier for 2014 onwards. On the morning of the first day of the test, they ran Tayo Linus, who was racing for them in the GP3 series, and then Chilton in the afternoon. Rodolfo Gonzalez ran on the second day, and on the morning of the third and final day before Bianchi took over in the afternoon. After this, it was time for the Hungarian Grand Prix. Rodolfo Gonzalez took Chilton's seat in FP1. Peak was fastest again in qualifying, 1 second behind Paul di Resta in 18th. Van der Garde was 3/10 of a second behind in 20th. Bianchi was 4/10 of a second behind in 21st, and then Chilton 3/10 of a second further back in 22nd and last. Van der Garde managed to go up the inside of Peak at turn 1, and then managed to pass Valtteri Bottas at turn 7, but Bottas repassed him on lap 2. The order remained unchanged for the rest of the race. Van der Garde came out on top to finish in 15th, 2 laps down on winner Lewis Hamilton. Peak ran a 2-stop strategy and was 6 seconds behind in 16th. Both Marussias ran long first stints on the medium tyres but were caught early by the blue flags and finished a lap down in 17th and 18th, 43 seconds apart. After the summer break came the Belgian Grand Prix. Marussia brought new suspension and brakes. Heikki Kovalainen ran in place of Peak in FP1 and Van der Garde crashed in FP2. On Saturday, FP3 was dry but rain came in qualifying. Everyone started on the intermediates, but Van der Garde made an early move to dry tyres, which meant he put in a stunning performance to set their third fastest time in Q1. Bianchi and Chilton both advanced as well with the 11th and 16th fastest times respectively. Charles Pic was called to the weighbridge, which left no time to switch to slicks, so he qualified 22nd and last. Q2 was dry, and Van der Garde, Bianchi and Chilton were the three slowest qualifiers and started the race 14th, 15th and 16th. Chilton had a terrible start and was immediately passed by Pastor Maldonado, Jean-Eric Vergne, Daniel Ricciardo, Valtteri Bottas and Esteban Gutierrez. Bianchi's start was better, but he was still squeezed out by Maldonado through Eau Rouge and then Vergne and Ricciardo down the Kemmel Straight. Van der Garde, by contrast, had a good start from 14th and passed Adrian Sutil at La Source. Bianchi was then further passed by Bottas and Gutierrez through Lecumbe, so he, Chilton and Pic were already back to 20th, 21st and 22nd. Van der Garde was repassed by Sutil at the bus stop chicane at the end of lap 1. Maldonado passed Van der Garde down the Kemmel Straight on lap 2, and Pic in turn passed Chilton for 21st. Vergne passed Van der Garde for 15th at Lecumbe on lap 3, and then Ricciardo then passed him at the bus stop chicane. He was then passed by Gutierrez down the Kemmel Straight on lap 4, and Bottas at the same place on lap 5, so the Marussia's qualifying heroics were undone in only 5 corners, but Van der Garde lasted 4 laps. Pic passed Bianchi for 20th down the Kemmel Straight on lap 6. At the end of lap 8, he then pulled into the pits and retired from the race with an oil leak. Van der Garde had created a 12-second advantage over the Marussias after the first round of pit stops on lap 15. Chilton first got the blue flags on lap 22 and Bianchi on lap 26. Maldonado and Paul di Resta collided at the bus stop chicane on lap 27 as Maldonado was entering the pits, which took di Resta out of the race and forced Maldonado to pit to replace his front wing, which brought him out behind Van der Garde. Van der Garde did his second stop on lap 29 and came out 9 seconds behind Maldonado. Maldonado received a 10-second stop-and-go penalty for causing the collision with di Resta, which allowed Van der Garde to pass him on lap 39. The race ended with Van der Garde in 16th, Bianchi 52 seconds behind in 18th, and Chilton 1 lap down in 19th and last. Heikki Kovalainen took Van der Garde's seat, and Rodolfo Gonzalez took Bianchi's seat in FP1 again at the Italian Grand Prix. Van der Garde was fastest in qualifying, 1.2 seconds behind Valtteri Bottas in 18th. Pic was less than 0.2 of a second behind in 20th. Bianchi was half a second slower in 21st, and then Chilton 0.4 of a second behind in 22nd and last, after discovering post-qualifying he had 19.5 extra kilograms of fuel than planned. Bianchi had a good start and got around both Caterhams off the line. Pic managed to pass Van der Garde into Variante del Rettifilo. Paul di Resta crashed out at Variante della Roggia, which gave everyone a place. Pic passed Bianchi at the Ascari chicane. Kimi Raikkonen pitted for repairs at the end of lap 1, which gave everyone another place, and Van der Garde then repassed Bianchi at Variante del Rettifilo on lap 2. Chilton passed Bianchi at the second Lesbo on lap 3, but Bianchi repassed him at the Ascari chicane on lap 4. Raikkonen caught and passed Chilton and Bianchi on lap 9, Van der Garde on lap 14 and Pic on lap 16. Jean-Eric Vergne pulled over on lap 15, which gave everyone another place. Van der Garde made his second stop on lap 39, but the pit crew were not ready for him and he came out behind Bianchi. He was able to repass Bianchi at Variante del Rettifilo on lap 44. Contrary to the rest of the grid, Pic and Van der Garde ran 2-stop strategies and came home in 17th and 18th, 15 seconds apart. Bianchi was 7 seconds behind Van der Garde in 19th, and Chilton ran with Bianchi the whole race but fell back due to blue flags at the end and finished 12 seconds behind in 20th and last. Next up was the lights of the Singapore Grand Prix. Pic was fastest in qualifying, but was a whole 1.5 seconds off of Pastor Maldonado in 18th on the ultra-high downforce streets. Van der Garde was 0.2 of a second behind in 20th. Bianchi and Chilton were half a second behind on the back row. Bianchi had a good start and passed Van der Garde at turn 3 and Pic at turn 5. Van der Garde in turn passed Pic and Bianchi at turn 7 and 8, and then passed Valtteri Bottas at turn 18 for 18th. Bianchi made his first pit stop on lap 10, but he then had to pit again the following lap to replace his steering wheel, as soon as he left the pits he was struggling to select gears properly. This left him far behind in last. Van der Garde remained ahead of Bottas after their first pit stops on lap 13, but was passed by him on lap 70. Daniel Ricciardo crashed out on lap 24, which triggered the safety car. All 4 drivers pitted, and Bianchi was permitted to unlap himself. The race resumed at the end of lap 30. Van der Garde got back past Bottas at turn 1 on lap 33. Romain Grosjean pulled into the pits at the end of that lap, which gave everyone another place. Bottas took the place back from Van der Garde on lap 39. Peak ran a very long third stint and was passed by Van der Garde just before pitting on lap 54 and came out in last. Paul di Resta then crashed out, which gave another place to everyone. The race ended with Van der Garde in 16th, Chilton 7 seconds behind in 17th, Bianchi another 7 seconds behind in 18th, and Peak just 1/10 of a second behind in 19th and last after a last-minute sprint on fresh tyres. At the Korean Grand Prix, Marussia announced that Bianchi would remain with them for 2014. The partnership between Marussia and the Ferrari Academy driver had been reinforced by the new technical partnership beginning with Ferrari in 2014 as well. Rodolfo Gonzalez took Chilton's seat in FP1, but crashed only a few laps in. Peak was fastest in qualifying, almost a whole second behind Pastor Maldonado in 18th. Van der Garde was only 7/1000ths of a second slower in 20th. Less than half a second covered the 4 drivers, with Bianchi and Chilton occupying the back row once again. Bianchi had qualified 21st, but received a 3-place grid penalty for blocking Paul di Resta in qualifying and so started 22nd. Chilton had a good start and almost passed Van der Garde at turn 1, who almost pushed Bianchi off the track. Peak in turn almost passed Maldonado. A collision further up the field sent Felipe Massa into a spin at turn 3 and forced all 4 drivers into the runoff area. Van der Garde was able to pass Peak, Adrian Sutil, Valtteri Bottas and Jean-Luc Vergne, and Bianchi passed Chilton. Massa recovered quickly to pass Chilton as well. Vergne passed Van der Garde and Massa passed Bianchi at turn 3 on lap 2, and at the same place the following lap Van der Garde was passed by Bottas and Peak was passed by Massa. Sutil then passed Van der Garde at turn 4. Jenson Button pitted for a new front wing on lap 3. Massa passed Van der Garde at turn 3 on lap 4, and Sutil then pitted for a new front wing as well, giving all 4 drivers 2 places. Button passed Chilton on lap 8. The 4 drivers pitted in consecutive laps from laps 9 to 12 and came out 19th to 22nd. Van der Garde was also awarded a drive-through penalty for forcing Bianchi off the track at turn 1 at the start of the race, and so he came out in 22nd. Van der Garde first got the blue flags on lap 22, Chilton on lap 23 and Bianchi on lap 24. Paul di Resta crashed out on lap 26, which moved everyone up a place. A safety car was triggered on lap 31 after Sergio Perez suffered a tyre blowout on the back straight. All 4 drivers immediately pitted as there was a large enough gap between each driver to double stack. Peak was then lapped by race leader Sebastian Vettel after exiting the pits. Van der Garde came out in front of Chilton. All 4 drivers were permitted to unlap themselves. The race resumed at the end of lap 36. Sutil span and hit Mark Webber at turn 3, which set Webber's car on fire and gave all 4 drivers 2 places. Van der Garde passed Bianchi at turn 4 and the safety car came out again the following lap after a fire car was sent out on its own. Vergne pitted, which moved everyone up a place. The race resumed at the end of lap 40. Van der Garde locked up heavily into turn 1 and had Bianchi right behind him down the back straight. Bianchi went up the inside of turn 3 and pushed Van der Garde off the track, and Vergne passed Chilton. Sutil then passed Chilton at turn 4 and then pitted at the end of lap 41. Vergne then passed Van der Garde at turn 3, and Bianchi at the same place the following lap. On lap 45, Vergne passed Peak and Van der Garde passed Bianchi at turn 3. Sutil never caught back up and retired on lap 50. Both Toro Rossos retired with faulty brakes on laps 53 and 54, which gave 2 more last-minute places to everyone. The race ended with Peak 14th, Van der Garde 15th, Bianchi 16th and Chilton 17th. Formula 1 stayed in the Far East for the Japanese Grand Prix. Heikki Kovalainen took over Peak's seat in FP1. Van der Garde went off at turn 9, which ended his session early. Bianchi also went off at turn 9 but crashed much harder, which meant his car couldn't be repaired in time for FP2. After FP2, news came out that Marussia's former test driver Maria de Villota had been found dead, aged 33, in a hotel room in Seville in Spain, exactly 1 year after she made her first public appearance following an accident during a test session with Marussia in July 2012 that left her with severe head injuries. The cause of death was found to be a heart attack caused by said injuries. Bianchi's car was fixed in time for FP3. In qualifying, it was Chilton who was fastest for the first time that year, making this the first qualifying session since the Chinese Grand Prix in April that Marussia had beaten both Caterhams. Peak was 0.2 of a second behind in 20th, Van der Garde was 0.3 of a second further back, and then Bianchi 1/10 of a second further back in 22nd. Peak and Bianchi both received 10-place grid penalties after receiving their 3rd reprimands of the year at the Korean Grand Prix for failing to slow sufficiently for yellow flags. On top of this, in a first, Peak was awarded a drive-through penalty for leaving the pit lane when it was closed, which he would have to serve within the first 5 laps of the race. Adrian Sutil in turn received 2 5-place grid penalties which moved him to 22nd and left Chilton 18th, Van der Garde 19th, Peak 20th and Bianchi 21st. Adrian Sutil immediately passed all 4 drivers off the line. They were 4 abreast going into turn 1. Van der Garde had the worst start of the 4 and was squeezed in between Chilton and Bianchi. He lost his front wing, which sent him into the back of Bianchi. Bianchi lost his rear wing and span off into the gravel trap, and Van der Garde speared into the barriers head-on. Lewis Hamilton received a puncture at turn 1, which allowed Chilton and Peake to pass him at turn 4. Peake then served his drive-through penalty at the end of lap 1, which left him 20 seconds behind Chilton, but still in front of Hamilton. Hamilton never caught Peake and retired on lap 8. Chilton first pitted on lap 11 and Peake on lap 17. Peake was now 21 seconds behind, but was on faster tyres. Peake first got blue flags on lap 23 and Chilton on lap 29. Chilton did his second stop on lap 29 and Peake on lap 35. Peake was now 11 seconds behind and eventually caught and passed Chilton on lap 46, and a quiet race for both ended with them 19 seconds apart in 18th and 19th. Next up was the last ever Indian Grand Prix. Marussia brought a new suspension upgrade. It was Bianchi who came out on top in qualifying, only 1/10 of a second behind Maldonado in 18th. Van der Garde was 1/10 behind in 20th, Peake 4/10 behind in 21st, and then Chilton 7/10 behind in 22nd. In a rare moment of competitiveness, only 2.5 seconds covered the entire grid in Q1. Race day was incredibly hazy and dusty. Van der Garde had a slightly poor getaway and was swamped by Peake and Chilton. Coming out of turn 1, he was passed by both, who then squeezed him in and broke his front wing and suspension. Chilton got away scot-free, but Peake received a puncture. Van der Garde pulled over onto the grass, but managed to get going again and crawl round to the pits to retire. Peake pitted and was 50 seconds behind the rest of the field. Paul di Resta and Jean-Eric Vergne pitted for repairs on lap 1, and then Fernando Alonso on lap 2, which moved Bianchi and Chilton up to 16th and 17th. There were numerous extremely early first pit stops for the drivers on soft tyres, including Bianchi on lap 5, who came out in 20th, 20 seconds ahead of Peake. Chilton was up to 14th, but it was passed by Paul di Resta on lap 8, Kimi Raikkonen, Jenson Button, Vergne and Alonso on lap 9, and Maldonado on lap 11. Button pitted again on lap 12, but passed Chilton again on lap 18. Peake was first lapped on lap 14. He had been gaining on Bianchi, but he developed another puncture and pitted again on lap 16. Chilton eventually made his first pit stop on lap 29, and Bianchi made his second on lap 33, which left them 12 seconds apart. Peake was a minute further behind and retired on lap 36 after the hydraulics failed, which gave Caterham their first double retirement of the season. Mark Webber retired as well on lap 40, which gave a place to both Marussias. Chilton eventually made his second stop on lap 52, by which point he was 25 seconds ahead of Bianchi and stayed in front. A last-minute retirement for Nico Hülkenberg left them to finish in formation as 17th and 18th, 2 laps down on race winner and newly crowned 4-time champion Sebastian Vettel. After this was the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix. Heikki Kovalainen took Van der Garde's seat and Rodolfo Gonzalez took Chilton's seat in FP1. Van der Garde came out on top in qualifying, but was 1.2 seconds behind Adrian Sutil in 18th. Bianchi was 1/10 of a second behind in 20th, Peake another 10th behind in 21st, and Chilton 7/10 slower in 22nd. Bianchi received a 5-place grid penalty for changing his gearbox after FP3, which put him behind Chilton, but Kimi Raikkonen was then disqualified from qualifying, which moved everyone up a place. Chilton had the strongest start and passed both Caterhams into turn 1. Raikkonen tried to go up the inside of Van der Garde, but they made contact and broke Raikkonen's suspension, putting him out of the race and letting Peake pass Van der Garde. Chilton's advantage was short-lived as he was passed by Peake at turn 8 and Van der Garde and Bianchi at turn 11. Jenson Button pitted for a new front wing on lap 2, which moved everyone up a place. Van der Garde and Peake both managed to pass Valtteri Bottas on lap 2. The 4 drivers pitted in consecutive laps from laps 5 to 8, but remained in the same order. Button pitted for a second time on lap 11, which put him back behind both Caterhams, but he passed Van der Garde again on lap 16 and Peake on lap 17. Chilton first got the blue flags on lap 21 and Bianchi on lap 23. Peake was ordered by the team to let Van der Garde through on lap 23 as they were on the same strategy, but Peake was suffering from understeer which was slowing him down. Peake got the blue flags on lap 27 and Van der Garde on lap 29. The second round of pit stops came on laps 31 to 33. Chilton and Bianchi were lapped for a second time on laps 45 and 46. Another quiet race ended with Van der Garde in 18th, 25 seconds behind the next car, Peake 11 seconds behind in 19th, Bianchi a whole minute and an extra lap behind in 20th, and Chilton 5 seconds behind in 21st. By finishing the race, Chilton set a new record for most consecutive finishes from the start of a career with 17. For the United States Grand Prix, Heikki Kovalainen was loaned over to Lotus for 2 races to cover for Kimi Raikkonen while he was having back surgery. Alexander Rossi ran in place of Van der Garde in FP1 for his home race, and Rodolfo Gonzalez took Bianchi's seat as well. Vandergaard came out fastest in qualifying again, 1.2 seconds behind Pastor Maldonado in 18th. Bianchi and Peake were both only a tenth behind, and Chilton was a whole second slower in 22nd, and was also given a drive-through penalty to serve within the first 5 laps of the race for impeding both Maldonado and Adrian Sutil during their qualifying runs. Peake as well was given a 5-place grid penalty for a gearbox change which moved him to 22nd, and a grid penalty for Esteban Gutierrez moved Vandergaard and Bianchi up a place. Gutierrez immediately passed Bianchi and Vandergaard off the line. Bianchi and Chilton both passed Vandergaard at turn 1. Vandergaard and Peake both passed Chilton down the back straight into turn 16, and Sutil then crashed out, which triggered the safety car. Gutierrez pitted and came out behind all 4 drivers. The race resumed at the end of lap 4. Gutierrez passed Chilton at turn 7 and Peake at turn 16. Chilton took his drive-through penalty at the end of lap 5, which left him 15 seconds behind Peake. Gutierrez then passed Vandergaard at turn 16 on lap 6 and Bianchi at the same place on lap 7. Maldonado pitted for a new front wing on lap 8 and came out behind all 4 drivers. He passed Chilton on lap 13 and Peake, Vandergaard and Bianchi during their pit stops on laps 20 and 21. Chilton got the first blue flags on lap 27, Peake on lap 36 and Vandergaard and Bianchi on lap 37. Peake took a drive-through penalty on lap 50 for ignoring blue flags. Chilton was lapped for a second time on lap 51. Another largely uneventful race ended with Bianchi in 18th, Vandergaard 2 seconds behind in 19th after trying several times unsuccessfully to pass Bianchi, Peake 30 seconds behind in 20th, having been right behind Vandergaard until his drive-through penalty, and Chilton a whole lap down in 21st. The season reached its conclusion with the Brazilian Grand Prix. Marussia had held on to 10th in the Constructors' Championship the entire year, but there was still every chance of Caterham getting the magic 13th place they needed to take it back. Rodolfo Gonzalez was given one last go in the MR02 in a wet FP1 in place of Chilton. Qualifying was wet. Peake ended the final session of the year fastest, only 0.4 of a second off of Esteban Gutierrez in 18th. Vandergaard was half a second slower in 20th. Bianchi was only 0.04 slower than Vandergaard, and Chilton was 0.6 slower in 22nd. A grid penalty for Sergio Perez moved Peake up to 18th. Race day was dry. Peake had a poor start and was passed by Perez, Vandergaard and Bianchi off the line. Bianchi had another good start and passed Vandergaard in the Senna S. Romain Grosjean's engine went up in smoke on the start-finish straight on lap 3, which all 4 drivers had to crawl through. This put Bianchi right behind Kovalainen, but also left Chilton 5 seconds behind Peake. Vandergaard took 18th from Bianchi on lap 5, and Peake passed Bianchi on lap 7. Bianchi first pitted on lap 21, Vandergaard on lap 24, Peake on lap 25 and Chilton on lap 26, and were now all lapped. Vandergaard was altered to let Peake through on lap 39 as Peake was faster. Valtteri Bottas crashed out on lap 46, which gave everyone a place. Vandergaard and Bianchi did their second stops on lap 47 and Chilton on lap 48. Chilton was lapped for a second time on lap 50. Vandergaard took a drive-through penalty on lap 52, which put him behind Bianchi. Vandergaard was lapped for a second time on lap 54. Peake was 25 seconds ahead of Bianchi and yet to do his second stop when his suspension gave way at Descida de Largo on lap 59 and he was out of the race. Bianchi was then lapped for a second time. Another quiet race ended with Bianchi in 17th, Vandergaard 10 seconds behind in 18th after his drive-through penalty, and Chilton 45 seconds behind in 19th and last. 2013 was by far Marussia's strongest season so far. They had a slower car than Caterham for most of the year, but were still able to race closely with them. Reliability had improved considerably. There were only 2 mechanical retirements across the entire season. However, reliability had improved across the board, which created no real opportunities to grab points at the behest of faster teams. Nonetheless, in their 4th attempt, they came out on top to secure 10th place in the Constructors' Championship. Caterham had a slower start to the season than they would have liked, as the car still wasn't fully developed at the start. Despite having the faster car most of the year, the damage had been done only 2 races in. Reliability had also got worse since 2012, though only marginally, with 4 mechanical retirements. More importantly, however, they had made absolutely no progress in catching up to the faster teams, and if anything, the gap had widened. They ended up being toppled by Marussia to finish 11th and last in the Constructors' Championship. Jules Bianchi proved himself to be a huge talent, and at the end of the year was given the Autosport Rookie of the Year award. He won the Marussia qualifying battle 17-1 and the race battle 14-2. Despite being overtaken development-wise by Caterham, he had little problems keeping up with them, and was also a clean racer who rarely made mistakes. He finished 19th in the championship with a best finish of 13th at the Malaysian Grand Prix. Charles Pic was the only non-rookie of the 4 drivers, and it showed as he set the benchmark in most qualifying and race battles. He just won the Caterham qualifying battle 10-9, but more comfortably won the race battle 8-4. He bore the brunt of most of the team's reliability issues and finished 20th in the championship with a best finish of 14th at the Malaysian and Korean Grand Prix. Guido van der Garde had an up and down debut season. He was virtually equal on pace with Pic and was definitely the faster of the two after the summer break. None of the races were wet, however he shone in the wet qualifying sessions, particularly at Spa where he went 3rd fastest and gave Caterham their highest ever race start of 14th. However, he also retired 3 times due to accidents that were his fault, 2 of which happened on the first lap. He was displaced by teammate Heikki Kovalainen's 2 races for Lotus to finish 22nd in the championship with a best finish of 14th at the Hungarian Grand Prix. Max Chilton overall had a good rookie season, but it was completely overshadowed by his teammates who he was no match for. He outqualified him once and outraced him only twice. Despite being comfortably the slowest of the 4 drivers, he had a reliable car and also drove cleanly, as he set a new record by finishing all 19 races in his debut season. He finished 23rd and last in the championship with a best finish of 14th at the Monaco Grand Prix. This tied in with van der Garde, however van der Garde had 3 15th place finishes at the Malaysian, Monaco and Korean Grand Prix to Chilton's 16th place finish at the Malaysian Grand Prix. Join me for part 5, where we shall look at Caterham and Marussia's 2014 campaigns. Thanks for watching, don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe, follow me on Twitter @Brook_F1, and I'll see you all next time.